This lecture is Second Wave Feminism, looking at women in the United States from 1965 to 1980. We really see in this time period two streams of feminism. One that is a little bit more of a women's rights focus, which I call the women's rights wing, that tended to focus more on what we would think of at the time as more legal equality, a little bit more conservative in the sense that they tended to be supported by older laborers, women who came out of the civil rights movement, and they were just overall seen as more conservative in their approach. The women's liberation wing tended to be more young women interested in changing their personal lives at the ground level, initially mostly white and middle class younger women, but later working class and college campus women as well, that were really trying to shake up the status quo and really look at the social constructs of gender and femininity and turn it on its head. Looking at some of the catalysts behind the women's rights wing were, of course, John F. Kennedy's 1961 Commission on the Status of Women. He was pressured by Eleanor Roosevelt to start this commission. And it's led by Esther Peterson, who was of Bryn Mawr College. She headed this commission and found that discrimination was rampant in women's lives and came up with some prescribed remedies. She argued Polly Murray, who was an African-American lawyer and part of a contributor to the Commission of the Status of Women, argued that the 14th Amendment extended rights to women. And in 1963, we see recommendations that came out to the federal government to give protection against gender discrimination, that women were entitled to lives outside of the home. And even though they're still primarily mothers, kind of trending on this 1950s feminine mystique ideology, they were entitled to equal wages and have access to more jobs. Women needed to have political office, and that there was a federal responsibility to provide childcare for working women. So that's what the commission found. And the first piece of federal legislation that comes from this is the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Right? This is the first piece of federal activity pertaining to women's lives since the 19th Amendment. And it gave women hope that things were changing in a positive direction for them. Of course, Betty Friedan's publishing of The Feminine Mystique in 1963 sort of supported this idea, the notion that women needed to get outside of the home. And in conjunction with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which included Title VII, that allowed gender to be thrown into the act to ensure that equality would be non-discriminate to women in the workplace. So what happens in 1964 with this Civil Rights Act is the creation of the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And this is what is going to enforce Title VII, that you cannot discriminate based on race, ethnicity, sex, nationality, all of those different subtitles of discrimination. And the commission initially wasn't intended to be used by women. It was mostly intended to be used for African Americans who wanted to file complaints that they were, rightfully so fired from a job or, discriminated against. But women quickly used the EEOC to their advantage to find and find evidence of gender discrimination in the workplace. Quickly, the National Organization for Women becomes the equivalent of the NAACP for African Americans in their quest for civil rights, right? That is what NOW is for women. And it's founded in 1966 in partnership with men to change how the sexes needed restructuring, that the inequalities hurt men too, they argued, and women and men are more alike and needed equality and less focus on the differences between men and women in order to have a productive workforce, to have good education, and to have a well-balanced political structure. So overall, the focus is on public life. Now focuses on rethinking the family and some social constructs. Definitely think going beyond public life. But women's liberation is going to expand on this more so. So overall, their focus is on anti-discrimination measures, the Equal Rights Amendment, making sure that gets passed, and childcare, maternity leave, and abortion rights, looking at reproductive rights as well. So Betty Friedan is the founder of NOW. She was in many ways a product of the Cold War. She had the same homophobias of a lot of others that were sort of in this Red Scare context. And so she did not allow lesbians to be a part of NOW and didn't really take up non-heterosexual or lesbian issues until the 1970s. So that's in some ways how we see this having a more conservative approach. But what we see is that it's radical in the sense that it's trying to redefine it's trying to redefine American citizenship through women's eyes. And in a way is redefining American liberalism. The Women's Liberation Wing, some of the catalysts for this were social movement activism, again, like the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Power movement, which provided focus on personal life and transformation. So models for organizing, ways to think about women's oppression, experience, and discrimination. This was much more the grassroots movement of the women's movement. So many of the ideals behind the women's liberation movement was this concept of how the personal is political. And it was bringing women's personal issues into the law. So many of the ideals that came from the civil rights movement, like the understanding that the personal is political, will be important for the women's lib movement. So it really all started in 1967 with what was sort of an offshoot of the New Left, women involvement in SDS, the Student for Democratic Society, where women started to maybe have, side conversations about their own subjugation, their own subordination within, the organizations like the SDS itself. And it led to these consciousness raising groups where there was a lot of talk about the male chauvinist system and how did women become so secondary. These groups talked about what women's role was within families, and that this kind of chauvinism existed in the family, but it existed in all institutions. They explored questions like, where did male chauvinism come from? Did it stem from the patriarchy of family or capitalism or both? These questions came from the conscious raising groups and led to the understanding, again, that the personal is political, that the law impacts women's personal lives in a way that many people didn't fully understand. So one of their first kind of demonstrations was a protest of a Miss American pageant in 1960. This was the first kind of women's liberation protest. And again, protesting the idea that women are dressing and making themselves up to be desirable to the male gaze. But this led to a lot of other action steps, really looking at systematic problems that became local projects and then would raise new issues, and then they would go about structuring and providing services. So one of the things we see is that comes up frequently is violence against women. This is something that was talked about in these consciousness raising groups, how rape and battery was a huge problem for many women. And Susan Brown Miller's book, Against Our Will, which rewrote rape procedures along feminist line to include, things like date rape and marital rape and acquaintance rape. In 1980, Take Back the Night became a focus for bringing greater public awareness to rape and domestic abuse survivors. We see at this time that domestic assault, wife beating becomes a felony. And we see the emergence of greater battered women's shelters. In 1980, we also see that sexual harassment becomes included in the EEOC guidelines to be part of what was discriminatory behavior. The hidden injuries of sex, women's health becomes more along feminist lines, that women wanted to be, that women were being treated without autonomy. The doctors were making decisions without their consent oftentimes. And it forced medical professionals to rethink the way they treated women who were simultaneously seeking to better understand their own bodies. So here we see really how pregnancy and childbirth changed. Women become much more involved in the process and more in control of the process, with classes and just greater information. So this is like this idea that knowledge was empowering to women. In 1973, the publishing of Our Bodies, Ourselves really focused in on women having a greater understanding of their own bodies. And lastly, what we see as a result of this is that we see women's issues and their history being brought into academia more. Studying sex and gender systems and social constructs of gender becomes something that are being looked at more from an academic perspective on college campuses. For educational statistics, women who graduate with a BA in 1950, the average was 23.9%. In 1960, that went up to 35%. In 1970, that went up to 51.5%. So women's studies became a part of college campuses in 1970, though we still continue to see very few tenured women professors. There were a few areas where the two wings really worked together. Right now, obviously, had its strength in the legal sense, and the women's liberation had its strength to really propel the movement, and they were good at getting press attention and being out there. And they come together in the 1970s around abortion, because without reproductive freedom, they believed that women could not have equality in the public sphere. And so some of the actions that they did together in 1969, the New York Speak Out Against Abortion, they wanted abortion to be a women's right. And they had people coming in, again, this is before abortion is legal, to talk about how they suffered these back alley abortions. And they really kind of centered it on people sharing their stories. In 1970, Women's Strike for Equality on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. It was described by Time magazine as the first demonstration of the women's liberation movement. And the leadership called the object of the rallies the unfinished business of equality. And I think we see the passage of Roe versus Wade in 1972 as a great win for the women's liberation and the women's movement together. So we also see growing support for the ERA bill. Congress approved it in 1972, and states start ratifying in the 1970s, though we'll also see a growing movement against the ERA with Phyllis Schlafly start in the mid 70s that eventually halts the success of the ERA bill.